A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hey everyone, welcome back to my Weird Prompts. This is episode 952, and I am here with my brother Herman Poppleberry. Today we are tackling a question that feels particularly heavy given the state of the world in early 2026. We are looking at the absolute limits of the state. Can a modern nation-state actually exist without a monopoly on violence? Is the laissez-faire state a beautiful dream of efficiency, or a radical, high-stakes experiment that is destined to collapse under its own weight?
It is the ultimate political science paradox, corn. We often view the state as this inevitable monolithic entity, but when you look at the fringes of history and modern policy, you realize that statehood is actually a spectrum. On one end, you have total centralization, and on the other, you have something that looks a lot like anarchy. And listeners, you might notice something different today. Usually, our housemate Daniel sends us an audio prompt to kick things off, but today we actually decided to pick the topic ourselves. This is something that has been bouncing around our dinner table conversations for a few weeks now.
It really has. We've been talking a lot about the nature of power and the state lately, especially with the shifting alliances we are seeing in Europe and the Pacific. It led us to a pretty radical question. What happens when the state just goes away? Or at least, what is the closest a modern society has ever come to functioning without a central government? We are going to dive into near anarchy scenarios, modern minimal intervention governments, and how some nations try to opt out of the global order entirely.
It is the ultimate experiment, right? We talk about the social contract like it is this unbreakable foundation of reality, but history shows us that the state is actually a relatively recent and sometimes fragile invention. The prompt we are tackling today is about the theoretical and practical limits of statehood. We are looking at how order emerges when the boss disappears.
I think we should start by clearing the air on definitions. When people hear the word anarchy, they usually think of chaos, Mad Max, and burning buildings. But in political science, anarchy has a much more technical meaning. It is just the absence of a central coercive authority. It does not necessarily mean a lack of order. It just means the order is not being imposed from the top down by a guy with a badge and a gun.
It is the difference between anarchy as a state of being and anomy, which is the actual breakdown of social norms and lawlessness. You can have a very orderly society that is technically anarchic if the rules are enforced through social pressure, private contracts, or customary law. The question is whether that can survive the complexities of the 21st century. Is anarchy a sustainable equilibrium? Or is it just a transitional state that inevitably leads back to a warlord or a dictator?
Well, the most famous, or perhaps infamous, example of this in our lifetime was Somalia between 1991 and 2006. This is the big one. For political scientists who study statelessness, when the regime of Siad Barre collapsed in 1991, Somalia entered a period of 15 years without a functioning central government. No president, no parliament, no national police force.
And the common narrative, especially in Western media at the time, was that it was just a decade and a half of pure misery. We saw the images for Black Hawk Down, we heard about the famine, and we assumed the lack of a state was the cause of all the suffering. But if you look at the economic data from that period, a much more nuanced and frankly shocking story emerges. Economists like Peter Leeson have pointed out that by many metrics, Somalia actually performed better during its stateless period than it did under the previous socialist dictatorship.
That sounds completely counterintuitive. How can a country with no Department of Transportation or central bank actually improve? Give me some specifics, Herman.
Okay, let us look at the benchmarks. If you compare Somalia to its neighbors like Ethiopia or Kenya during that same window, the Somali telecommunications sector was a revelation. By the late 90s and early 2000s, Somalia had some of the cheapest and most reliable mobile phone service in all of Africa. Because there was no government to grant a monopoly to a single state-run carrier, multiple private companies like Hormuz and Nationlink jumped in. They had to figure out how to interconnect their networks without a regulator, and they did it through private contracts because they wanted the customers. It took about 3 days to get a landline installed in Mogadishu in 1997, while it took years in neighboring countries with state-run monopolies.
So the lack of a regulator actually lowered the barrier to entry. But I have to push back here. Telephones are great, but what about the law? If someone steals my phone or breaks a contract in a stateless society, who do I call? There is no 911. There are no courts.
This is where it gets fascinating from a technical perspective. The Somalis relied on a traditional polycentric legal system called ZIR. It has been around for centuries, and it actually thrived when the state collapsed. ZIR is not based on a central legislature making rules. Instead, it is based on compensatory justice. It is essentially a massive, decentralized insurance network. Every individual is part of a dia-paying group, which is usually based on kinship or clan.
A dia-paying group? Explain that.
Dia refers to blood money or compensation. If I wrong you, my clan owes your clan a specific amount of compensation. If I kill someone, my group has to pay a fixed amount of livestock or currency to the victim's group. It turns justice into a cost-benefit analysis for the community rather than a moral crusade by a government. If you are a troublemaker, your clan has to keep paying out for your mistakes. Eventually, they will get tired of it and either force you to behave or outlaw you, meaning they withdraw their protection. In a stateless society, being an outlaw is a death sentence because you have no insurance. So, the community has a massive incentive to keep its members in line. It is law without a state.
It is interesting, but it feels like it has a massive scaling problem. It works great for local disputes between clans who share a culture and a language. But what happens when a French company wants to build a port in Berbera? They are not part of a dia-paying group. If the local elders decide to seize the port, the French company has no recourse. That seems to be why the Somali experiment eventually hit a ceiling.
That is the crucial point, Corn. Somalia showed that you can have basic infrastructure, like telecommunications, and even private electricity grids without a state. But it is very hard to achieve high-level capital accumulation. Without a recognized sovereign, you cannot easily tap into global financial markets. You cannot get sovereign credit ratings. You cannot sign treaties. So, while the Somali people were often better off than they were under a corrupt dictator, they could not transition into a modern industrial economy. They were stuck in a functional but low-level equilibrium.
Which brings us to the modern attempt to solve that exact problem, the Free Private Cities movement. Have you been following the legal saga with Próspera in Honduras? It feels like they are trying to take the lessons of Somalia, the efficiency of private provision, and wrap them in a legal shell that international investors can actually trust.
Oh, I have been diving deep into the Próspera files. For those who do not know, Próspera is a special economic zone, or a ZE, on the island of Roatan. It is essentially a jurisdiction where the governance is unbundled from the host nation of Honduras. They have their own civil law, their own regulatory framework, and they even allow residents to choose between different legal codes. You could choose to have your contracts governed by the law of Dubai, or Singapore, or even common law. It is a government as a service model.
And the technical mechanism they are using is basically an application of the Coase Theorem, right?
Ronald Coase was a Nobel Prize-winning economist who wrote The Problem of Social Cost. He argued that in a world with zero transaction costs, people would always bargain their way to the most efficient outcome, regardless of what the law says. But the world has massive transaction costs. It is expensive to find people to trade with, expensive to negotiate contracts, and expensive to enforce them. Coase argued that the firm, and by extension, the state exists specifically to lower those transaction costs.
So, the argument for a place like Próspera is that the modern state has become so bloated that it is actually increasing transaction costs through bureaucracy and unpredictable regulations. By creating a minimal state bubble, they are trying to lower those costs back down to near zero. They provide a predictable court system, often using international arbitrators, and then they get out of the way.
But here is the reality check. As of today, March 6, 2026, Próspera is in a massive legal battle with the Honduran government. The current administration in Honduras tried to repeal the ZEDI laws, leading to a multi-billion-dollar claim under the Central American Free Trade Agreement. This highlights the sovereignty risk of minimal intervention zones. You can have the most efficient rules in the world, but if the host state decides to bring in the tanks or change the locks, your private city is in trouble. It shows that you can never truly unbundle yourself from the reality of physical power.
It makes me think about the other side of the coin. If you cannot build a minimal states inside another country, can you be a minimal state on the global stage? This is where we get into the laissez-faire foreign policy. We talked about the United States as the world's policeman in episode 930. The US is the ultimate interventionist. But then you have a place like Liechtenstein.
Liechtenstein is my favorite example of this because it is almost a network state before the term existed. It is a tiny principality, but it is one of the wealthiest places on earth. And their approach to the state is almost radical. Prince Hans Adam II actually wrote a book called The State in the Third Millennium, where he basically argues that the state should be a service provider, not a master.
I love his secession clause. Herman, tell the listeners about Article 1 of their Constitution.
It is incredible. In 2003, they updated their constitution to give every single municipality in the country the right to secede. Think about that. If the central government in Vaduz decides to raise taxes or implement a regulation that the people of Trisenberg do not like, that village can literally vote to become an independent microstate or join another country. That is the ultimate check on state power. It turns the state into a landlord that has to keep its tenants happy, or they will just move the property out of the kingdom.
It is the ultimate laissez-faire approach to domestic policy. But how does a country like that survive in a world of giants? Liechtenstein has not had a standing army since 1868. They have a police force of about 120 people. If a neighboring power decided to invade, they could do it with a single paratrooper division.
This is where we have to address the free rider problem, which we touched on in episode 930. Liechtenstein is non-interventionist, but it is also landlocked between Switzerland and Austria. It exists under a security umbrella that it does not pay for. Switzerland handles its defense and many of its diplomatic functions. And Switzerland, in turn, is part of a broader European stability that has been underpinned by American power for 80 years.
Right. So is Switzerland's neutrality a self-sustaining principle, or is it a luxury? We talked about their good offices in episode 497. They remain neutral. They do not join military alliances like NATO, and they focus on being the world's intermediary. But if the U.S. Navy stopped patrolling the global shipping lanes tomorrow, or if the USS pulled out of Europe, would Switzerland be able to maintain that laissez-faire foreign policy?
Probably not. Sovereignty is not just a legal status, it is a capacity. If you cannot defend your trade routes, you are essentially outsourcing your sovereignty to whoever is patrolling the water. This is the conservative critique of non-interventionism. It argues that laissez-faire only works when there is a hegemon, providing the public good of security. If the world becomes a multipolar mess, the small, non-interventionist states are the first ones to get swallowed up or forced to pick a side.
It is like the free rider problem in economics. If everyone else is paying for the police, I can afford to be a pacifist. But if the police go on strike, I suddenly need a shotgun.
And that brings us to the Singapore model, which is the perfect counterpoint to the Somali or Liechtenstein models. People often point to Singapore as a bastion of economic freedom. They are always at the top of the Heritage Foundation's Index of Economic Freedom. Low taxes, minimal regulation on business, incredibly efficient ports. But the Singaporean state is actually incredibly interventionist in other ways.
Oh, absolutely. The state owns about 80% of the land in Singapore. They have mandatory national service for all male citizens. They have very strict social laws. We have all heard about the chewing gum ban, but it goes much deeper than that. They have a very capable military, and they spend a huge percentage of their GDP on defense.
So Singapore is the strong state for a free market model. They realized that to be a minimalist economic hub, they had to be a maximalist security state. They used their power specifically to create a high-trust, predictable environment where the market can be as laissez-faire as possible. It is the opposite of Somalia. Somalia had no state and saw some economic growth, but could not provide security. Singapore has a very strong state that uses its power to guarantee the market.
It is a governance arbitrage strategy. In a world where most large nation-states are becoming more bureaucratic and more indebted, Singapore offers a high-performance engine for commerce. They treat the country like a corporation. If a regulation is not helping the bottom line of Singapore Incorporated, it gets cut. But they are not libertarians, they are technocrats.
And that might be the most sustainable version of minimalism we have found so far. It is not about the absence of government, it is about the X-focus of government. This leads us to the governance arbitrage trend we are seeing in the 2020s. We are moving into an era where you live is becoming a choice between different service providers.
We are seeing this with digital nomad visas and e-residency programs. Estonia is the leader here. You can be an e-resident of Estonia without ever setting foot in the country. You get a digital ID. You can start a company. You can use their legal system and their business infrastructure from anywhere in the world. It is statehood as a subscription.
It is unbundling the state from the land. Think about the implications of that. If I can subscribe to Estonia's business law while living in a low-tax jurisdiction like El Salvador, which is trying its own experiment with Bitcoin City and special zones, and I use a private security firm for my physical safety, I have essentially constructed my own personal minimal intervention state. I have hacked the traditional nation-state model.
But we have to talk about the risks. One of the misconceptions we should address is the idea that minimal government equals a lack of rules. In fact, if you look at these high-performing minimal states, they often have very strict rules. They are just predictable rules.
That is a great point, Korn. Investors do not actually fear rules. They fear unpredictability. They fear a government that changes the tax code every 2 years to win an election. They fear a court system that is biased toward the brother-in-law of the judge. A minimal intervention state like Singapore or even the historical Zir system in Somalia relies on everyone knowing exactly what the consequences of an action will be. In the Zir system, the price for a specific crime was known by everyone. It was a fixed rate. That predictability is what allows markets to function.
So the real enemy of the market isn't necessarily the state, it is the arbitrary state. It is the government that intervenes based on the whims of a politician rather than a fixed set of laws. This is why these special economic zones, or SEZs, are so popular right now. They are trying to lock in a set of rules for 50 or 99 years so that people feel safe investing. We are seeing this in Dubai, in the newer zones in Nigeria, and across Southeast Asia.
But there is a reality check here for our listeners. Minimal intervention often requires a very specific set of conditions to survive. It either requires a high-trust, culturally cohesive society like Liechtenstein or the Somali clans, or it requires a specific geographic shield. If you try to implement a laissez-faire model in a society that is deeply divided or has no history of property rights, it usually turns into the chaos version of anarchy very quickly.
This brings us back to the domestic situation in the United States. We are seeing a kind of governance arbitrage happening right now between states. You have people leaving high intervention states like California or New York for states with more laissez-faire approaches like Florida or Texas. It is the same principle playing out at a subnational level. People are voting with their feet.
It is a competitive federalism. And when you look at the federal level, the debate over the administrative state is basically a debate over whether we should return to a more minimal intervention model. But as we discussed, it is very difficult to go from an interventionist state back to a minimal one. Once a government starts providing a service, people become dependent on it. It is like a one-way ratchet. It only grows. This is why the experiments in places like Honduras or the seasteading movements are so important. They are trying to find a reset button.
I want to go back to the foreign policy side for a second, because I think this is the most important takeaway for the audience. We mentioned that the global laissez-faire system actually requires a very powerful, very interventionist anchor. You cannot have a world of Liechtensteins without at least one United States.
That is the irony, isn't it? The freedom to be a minimal state is a gift of the current world order, if the U.S. moves toward a more non-interventionist, America First foreign policy. It is going to force all these other countries to decide what kind of state they want to be. If the policeman goes home, the merchants have to start carrying guns. We might see a return to a much more fragmented world where every small nation has to become a fortress.
It reminds me of the history of the Hanseatic League. They were a collection of merchant guilds and towns that created a massive decentralized trading network in Northern Europe during the Middle Ages. They had their own laws and their own protection. They were incredibly successful for centuries. But eventually, they were crushed by the rise of the centralized nation-states like Prussia and Russia. The minimal model was outcompeted by the total war model of the modern state.
And that is the big question for the 21st century. Can the service provider state survive in a world where predatory states still exist? Technology might be the game changer here. In the past, a big state could always crush a small one because they had more men and more steel. But in a digital world, a small, agile, tech-forward state can protect itself through cyber defense and decentralized finance.
So, what are the actionable takeaways for our listeners who are fascinated by this?
First, if you are looking for where these theories are being tested in the real world right now, keep an eye on special economic zones. They are the primary laboratories for the future of the state. Look at the Charter Cities concept by Paul Romer. Look at how El Salvador is trying to use Bitcoin to bypass the traditional financial state. These are the front lines.
Second, pay attention to the high trust factor. If you're thinking about moving to a low-intervention jurisdiction, look at the culture, not just the tax rate. Minimal government only works when there's a strong underlying culture of trust. If the trust isn't there, the minimal state will eventually be replaced by a warlord or a corrupt bureaucrat.
And third, do not take the global security architecture for granted. If you are planning your life or your business around the idea of a laissez-faire world, you have to realize that it is currently underpinned by American power. If that anchor moves, the whole ship of global trade is going to start rocking. You need to have a plan for a multipolar world where security is no longer a free public good.
I think that is a great place to wrap up. We have gone from the diapang groups of Somalia to the secession clause of Liechtenstein, and finally to the e-residency of Estonia. The common thread is the search for efficiency and the desire to escape the arbitrary power of a central authority.
Whether it is a Somali merchant in 1995 using a private satellite phone, or a developer in 2026 using a smart contract to bypass a slow court system, the impulse is the same. People want order without the overhead of a predatory state.
If the state is just a service provider, what happens when we move to a subscription model of citizenship? Is the future of the nation-state a move towards smaller, more specialized units? It is a wild thought to leave you with.
If you are interested in the foreign policy side of this, I really recommend checking out episode 930 on the US as the world's policeman. It provides the necessary context for why laissez-faire is often a luxury.
And if you want to hear more about how a small state can navigate a dangerous world through neutrality, episode 497 on Switzerland is a must-listen.
We want to thank our housemate Daniel for living with us and putting up with these conversations at 3 in the morning. Even though he did not send a prompt today, his presence in the house is definitely what sparks a lot of these ideas.
And to all of you listening, we really appreciate you being part of this journey with us. We have been doing this for 952 episodes now, and it is the engagement from this community that keeps us going. If you are enjoying the show, please take a second to leave us a review on your podcast app or on Spotify. It genuinely helps other people find the show and helps us grow.
You can find all of our past episodes, our RSS feed, and a contact form at our website, myweirdprompts.com. We love hearing from you, so don't be a stranger.
Thanks for listening to my Weird Prompts. We will be back next time with another deep dive into the strange, the technical, and the thought-provoking. Until next time, I am Corn Poppleberry.
And I am Herman Poppleberry. Take care, everyone.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts, that's the flows from sloth.